Before the funeral of Pope Francis, Commandant Schmidt had gathered the Swiss guards in the sacred chambers beneath the Vatican. His voice was stern and heavy, carrying the weight of centuries of tradition. "Remember," he warned, "any movement during the procession will dishonor not only the Pope but the very spirit of the Church itself. The eyes of the world will be upon you. This moment must remain perfect, without deviation, without falter." His words lingered in the air, thick with the gravity of their meaning. For the Swiss Guard, a symbol of unwavering discipline, stillness was not merely a duty, it was their identity, but as the Pope's simple cypress coffin emerged into the cold, silent light of St. Peter's Square, a quiet storm stirred within Lance Corporal Lucas Bowman. His polished boots remained firmly planted against the ancient stones of the square, his uniform pristine and unblemished, a testament to his 14 years of impeccable service. His face betrayed nothing, no hint of the emotions he struggled to control beneath his disciplined exterior. For years, he had mastered the art of stillness, of standing guard in the face of history, of holding the line without flinching, yet, today, something was different, as the coffin, bearing the weight of not just a man, but a symbol of faith, began its solemn journey through the square. Lucas felt something stir beneath his breastplate. It wasn't the physical weight of his halberd or the armor that covered him, it was something far deeper, something far more personal. Beneath his uniform, in the quiet recesses of his chest, there was a letter. A letter he had kept hidden for days, feeling its weight not only in his hands but in his heart. It was from Pope Francis himself. For years, Lucas had been a model of Swiss Guard perfection. Not a single infraction, not a single deviation from the code. His life had been shaped by his discipline, molded by the exacting standards of the Guard. But within the folds of his armor, hidden from the world, was a letter from a man he had sworn to protect, a letter that spoke not only of duty but of something more profound, a reminder of the humanity they shared, of the compassion that existed beyond the rigidity of their vows. As the procession moved slowly, Lucas held his gaze steady, but his heart raced. He knew that this moment, this fragile thread of time, was far more than just ceremonial. It was a reckoning. The Pope's final message, sealed with years of wisdom and grace, was a reminder that sometimes, true duty was not about standing still in obedience to tradition, but knowing when to move in service to something greater than oneself. His fingers brushed the edge of the letter once more, the faint crinkle of the paper sending a shiver down his spine. It was a message from a pope who had once looked into his eyes and spoken words that had forever altered the course of his life. Sometimes the holiest thing we can do is move when we're told to stand still, and as the sound of the procession echoed through the square, the weight of that simple message carried with it the burden of a choice Lucas had never expected to face in the sacred stillness of this moment. Would he stay true to the letter of his duty, or would he honor the spirit of the Pope's final message, knowing that sometimes, the greatest act of discipline is not in the silence of stillness, but in the courage to act when the world expects you to remain motionless? In the next heartbeat, the world held its breath, and the line between tradition and compassion blurred. As the weight of the letter pressed against Lucas Bowman's chest, his mind was transported to a different time, a different place, years before the Pope's funeral, in the midst of a routine papal audience. Lucas had been standing tall at his post, perfectly still, as was expected of him. The square was filled with pilgrims and admirers, each focused on the holiness of the moment. The air was thick with reverence, the murmur of prayers and whispers mixing with the distant sound of organ music, but in the midst of that perfect order, a sound pierced through the crowd, a child's cry. Sharp and desperate, cutting through the silence like a knife. A little boy, no more than 5, had been separated from his parents, lost in the sea of people. His cries were filled with fear, and his tiny hands reached out in desperation, his face twisted in terror. Every part of Lucas' training screamed for him to remain motionless, to stay in place as the protocol demanded. His mission was not to intervene, not to disrupt the order of the event. But the child's cries were a plea that Lucas could not ignore. In that moment, the stillness he had mastered for years seemed like a cold, unfeeling barrier to the very compassion he was taught to embody. Without thinking, he took a step forward. Breaking protocol, and in one fluid motion, he lifted the child above the crowd, offering him comfort in the chaos. The mother found them quickly, rushing through the crowd to reclaim her son, her gratitude apparent in the way she held him tightly against her chest. It was a brief moment, an act so small it could have been unnoticed by everyone around him. But not by the Pope. Pope Francis, ever attentive to the hearts of his people, had witnessed the act. 2 days later, Lucas was summoned to the Vatican's private chambers. The invitation, simple and quiet, came from a Vatican aide who escorted him through the familiar halls. But this time, the air felt different, as though the weight of the meeting was heavier than any ceremony or guard duty he had experienced before. When Lucas arrived at the modest study, Pope Francis sat in a simple chair by the window, his weathered face softened by the gentle afternoon light. The Pope's eyes, sharp and warm, met his as he gestured for Lucas to sit. There was no formality, no grandeur in the room, just the raw presence of a man who had spent his life dedicated to the service of others. "You know why I asked for you, Lucas?" Pope Francis inquired softly, his voice carrying the wisdom of years spent serving not just the Church, but humanity itself. Lucas hesitated, unsure of what to say, but the Pope continued before he could speak. "You left your post," the Pope said, pointing toward a monitor where footage of the audience was playing. It was grainy, but clear enough to show Lucas break in protocol, lifting the child above the crowd. But why? Lucas shifted uncomfortably, the weight of the question settling on his shoulders. He wasn't sure how to explain what had driven him to act. It wasn't just about the child, it was something deeper. It was an instinct, a pull that felt like a whisper in his soul. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "The child reminded me of someone I couldn't reach when I was younger." The Pope listened, his face softening with understanding. He didn't need to know the specifics of Lucas' past, the pain he had carried with him. He simply nodded, recognizing something within Lucas that went beyond duty and protocol. "You see," Pope Francis said, "sometimes the holiest thing we can do is move when we're told to stand still. Compassion is not bound by rules. It is the heart of service." It was in that moment, sitting across from the Pope, that Lucas understood something profound, that true service wasn't about blind adherence to rules. It was about responding to the human need in front of you. It was about recognizing when the greatest discipline was to bend the rules, not out of recklessness, but out of love and care for others. As the conversation shifted, the Pope spoke of his own regrets, his own moments of choosing institutional loyalty over human compassion. "We must not forget that sometimes, even in our duties, the soul must remain connected to the heart of what we serve," the Pope said. His voice was gentle, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of a man who had seen the world and understood its complexities. Before Lucas left, the Pope rose with some difficulty, his frailty evident in the way he moved. But his eyes, filled with the wisdom of decades, held Lucas' gaze. "There is a tradition in Argentina," the Pope said, "where we say goodbye twice. Once for the body, once for the soul." He placed a hand on Lucas' shoulder, his touch light but meaningful. "Remember that when the time comes." Lucas left the room changed, unable to fully articulate the shift within him. But as he walked back to his quarters, a quiet understanding settled over him. His duty was not simply to stand still in the face of tradition. It was to move when the time called for it. To act when compassion demanded it. Days before the funeral, Lucas had returned to his quarters after an evening patrol. The weight of his thoughts lingered, still stirred by the Pope's words. As he sat in the dimly lit room, his attention was drawn to a slight figure that appeared in the shadows near St. Anne's Gate. Father Ventresca, the Pope's former secretary, approached with the same quiet authority that had marked his years in the Vatican. "I have something for you," Father Ventresca said softly, his voice carrying a touch of sadness. He withdrew a cream-colored envelope from beneath his cassock, sealed with a faint mark, no address, no formal insignia, just a single line written in a delicate, shaky hand. for the man who once stood guard in tears. Lucas knew at once who it was from. Pope Francis. With a deep breath, he broke the seal, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded the paper. Inside was a letter, written by the Pope in his final days, a letter that spoke not only of duty but of the deeper spirit of service. "If you're reading this," the letter began, "I have gone to meet our Father. Strange how we spend our lives preparing for this journey, yet still approach it like bewildered travelers without a map. I have been thinking about our conversation, the boy in the crowd, your brother, the rules, and when to break them. In you, Lucas, I saw something rare. You stand guard, not just out of duty, but out of love for what that duty represents. It is men like you we need, especially when no one is watching." The words, simple yet profound, echoed in Lucas' mind. His heart swelled as he read further. Discipline is important, but there are times when the greatest discipline is knowing when to move, when to act with compassion and humanity. If you ever find yourself torn between the letter of tradition and its spirit, remember this: I saw you. God sees you. And perhaps, that is enough. The letter ended with a single, powerful line: "When the time comes for my final procession, I will not hear your footsteps, but I will feel them." As Lucas sat there, staring at the letter in his hands, a quiet resolve filled him. The Pope's final message was not just for him, it was a call to anyone who would listen. To anyone who would stand guard over their own life, not just in duty, but in compassion. As the funeral procession of Pope Francis moved through the solemn streets of St. Peter's Square, the world watched in stillness, awaiting the ritual to unfold with unwavering precision. The Swiss guards, statues of discipline, stood silent at their posts, embodying centuries of tradition. But in that moment, amidst the reverent silence of the crowd, Lance Corporal Lucas Bowman made a choice that no one could have anticipated. As the Pope's simple cypress coffin was carried forward, Lucas felt a shift within him, a quiet voice within his soul telling him that this was his moment. His legs, long accustomed to standing still, moved with intention. His eyes, usually fixed on the horizon, were drawn not to the crowd, but to the sacred box before him. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow, the eyes of the world were upon him, but Bowman's mind was elsewhere. He stepped forward, breaking ranks, something unthinkable for one who had lived his life in strict adherence to the Swiss Guards code. His hand, steady yet filled with a deep, quiet reverence, reached out and placed itself upon the Pope's coffin. His fingers, clad in the pristine white gloves of a soldier, lingered there for a moment, a gesture of respect, of tribute, of farewell. In that stillness, Lucas whispered a final goodbye in his native tongue, the words barely audible but charged with emotion. "For your final journey," he murmured. It wasn't meant to be heard by anyone but himself, and yet, in the perfect acoustics of the square, his words carried far beyond his own ears, echoing in the hearts of those closest to him. The gesture was brief, a fleeting second in the grand tapestry of the ceremony, but it was a moment that reverberated with more power than any action that had come before it. The world continued, unaware of the weight behind that simple movement. The crowd remained absorbed in the funeral, their eyes fixed on the ceremony, not noticing the quiet act of devotion that had just unfolded before them. But the Vatican saw it. They saw Lucas, standing alone in that moment of profound humanity, choosing to honor the Pope not with rigid protocol, but with a deeply personal, silent act of love. And then, in the distance, Cardinal Ray, who had been leading the blessing, did something subtle, something almost imperceptible to the masses, but to Lucas, it spoke volumes. As Bowman stepped back, his hand returning to its perfect position, Cardinal Ray, standing at the coffin, adjusted his motion. He did not acknowledge the gesture with words, nor did he interrupt the flow of the ceremony. Instead, with a gentle shift of the incense, he subtly adjusted the blessing so as not to disturb the mark Lucas had left upon the sacred cypress box. It was a silent, unspoken acknowledgement. A recognition that, despite the break in protocol, what Lucas had done was not a violation, but a tribute. In that moment, the rigid boundaries between tradition and compassion, between duty and humanity, seemed to blur, and the Vatican quietly accepted what had transpired: a man, standing not just as a soldier, but as a servant of something greater. The moment passed, and the blessing continued. But the power of Lucas' silent act lingered in the air. His actions had spoken louder than any protocol could, and though no words were spoken to acknowledge it, the quiet acceptance from Cardinal Ray spoke volumes. It was as if the entire ceremony, the entire weight of the Pope's legacy, understood that there are times when the most profound discipline is to step outside of the rules and to move in service of something deeper. Something more compassionate. As Bowman resumed his position, standing still once more, his heart was light, his soul at peace. He had fulfilled his duty, not through blind obedience, but through a deeper understanding of what true service meant. The watchman had stood guard, not just with his eyes, but with his heart. And in doing so, he had honored the Pope's final journey in the most powerful way he could. With a quiet, unspoken tribute that transcended all tradition and spoke directly to the soul, behind the sacred doors of the Vatican, where the world could not see, a quiet debate unfolded. The Church leadership, ever bound by tradition and the weight of centuries, convened to discuss the actions of Lance Corporal Lucas Bowman. The murmurs echoed softly within the ancient walls, the air thick with the tension of the decision that loomed before them. Bowman had broken protocol. He had deviated from the sacred code, stepping forward when tradition demanded he remain still. He had touched the Pope's coffin. He had whispered a final farewell in a moment of deep, personal reverence. The silence that followed his action had been heavy, and now, behind closed doors, the leaders of the Church wrestled with how to respond. The question was not whether Bowman had broken tradition, but whether his actions had dishonored the Pope, the Church, and the sacred customs that had been upheld for centuries. In the eyes of the world, his actions were audacious, unthinkable. But within the walls of the Vatican, there was something else, something deeper, that needed to be weighed. The leaders knew that discipline was paramount, that the sacred traditions of the Church could not be abandoned for any reason. But there was also an understanding that tradition, in its most rigid form, could sometimes blind the heart to the deeper meaning of service. In the quiet chambers where decisions were made, a different truth began to surface. Lucas Bowman's action had not been born from rebellion. It had been born from love. Love for the man he had sworn to protect, and love for the calling that had brought him to this moment. It was a moment of profound humanity, something that could not be ignored, even by those who had spent their lives upholding tradition, and so, after much deliberation, the decision was made. The Church would not punish Bowman for his actions. They would not strip him of his honor or tarnish his spotless service record. Instead, they would transfer him. A quiet exile, away from the public gaze, to a place where he could reflect in peace. Bowman was reassigned to the Vatican Apostolic Archives, a place that existed in the shadow of history. A place where the stories of centuries were preserved, but unseen. It was a position far removed from the ceremonial duties of the Swiss Guard, away from the eyes of the faithful, away from the spotlight. The archives were vast, filled with ancient manuscripts and sacred relics, each piece a silent testament to the Church's history. The decision was not a punishment in the traditional sense. Rather, it was a shift, a redirection. Bowman would no longer stand in the bright light of the Vatican ceremonies. Instead, he would guard the stories of the Church itself, those whispered secrets of the past, hidden from the world but rich with meaning. It was a quiet exile, yes, but it was one that suited Lucas in a way that no punishment could. The Apostolic Archives were a place of reflection, a place where the weight of history could be felt in every document, in every whispered prayer. Here, in the silence of ancient corridors, Bowman would continue his service, not in the pomp of public displays, but in the deep, quiet work of preserving the very soul of the Church. As he walked through the labyrinthine halls of the archives, Bowman found something he hadn't expected. In this silence, far from the eyes of the world, he could hear the whisper of his own soul. The discipline he had learned in the guard was still with him, but now it took on a different form, a quiet, inner discipline that allowed him to serve not with his actions alone, but with his heart, his mind, and his spirit. The world had seen only a brief moment, a fleeting gesture that broke tradition. But in the quiet corners of the Vatican, in the forgotten archives filled with the wisdom of centuries, Lucas Bowman found something far more profound. He found the true meaning of service, not in standing still, but in knowing when to move with compassion, when to act with love, and when to let go of tradition in favor of something deeper. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Lucas continued his work in the archives. No longer in the public eye, he served in the shadows, guarding not just the history of the Church, but the understanding that true service comes not from conformity, but from the willingness to listen to the deeper call within. In this quiet exile, Bowman came to realize something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Sometimes, the most sacred moments are not the ones that are witnessed by the world, but the ones that are shared only with the soul. And in this silence, he had found a peace that no public ceremony could ever offer. Weeks passed, and the Vatican's corridors continued their quiet rhythm. The grand ceremonies that once filled Lucas Bowman's days had now become a distant memory. His life, once marked by the precision of ceremonial duties and the discipline of the Swiss Guard, had shifted into the shadowed halls of the Vatican Apostolic Archives. It was here, amidst the silence of centuries-old manuscripts and relics, that Bowman's true service began to take on new meaning. And yet, the world was still watching, still whispering, still wondering about the man who had broken ranks, the Swiss Guard who had dared to move when tradition demanded stillness. One afternoon, as Bowman quietly moved through the courtyard, a voice called out to him, a young voice, unassuming and full of curiosity. It was a schoolboy, no older than 12, visiting the Vatican with his classmates. The boy, noticing Bowman's distinct black and gold uniform, stopped in his tracks, a look of recognition and awe spreading across his face. "Excuse me, are you the guard who moved?" the boy asked, his eyes wide with innocent wonder. The question hung in the air, charged with the weight of something more than mere curiosity. To the boy, Bowman was not just a guard, but a figure of myth, of legend, the man who had broken protocol in a moment of emotion, the one who had dared to step forward when no one else would. Bowman paused, his gaze meeting the boy's. There was a quiet moment of recognition between them, a shared understanding, though neither of them fully grasped the depth of what had transpired. The boy's question was simple, yet it carried the weight of the world. "Were you scared?" he asked again, his voice filled with an innocent but profound curiosity. Lucas considered the question for a moment, his gaze softening as he looked at the young boy. His life, his actions, were not things that could easily be explained in simple terms. Nor could they be understood by those who had not felt the weight of that moment. And yet, Bowman knew that in this fleeting moment, he had the chance to pass something on, a lesson, not about rules or traditions, but about something deeper. Something that could only be felt, never fully explained. "No," Lucas said quietly, his voice gentle but firm. "I wasn't scared. I did what I felt was right." The boy stood there, puzzled for a moment. But in that silence, something shifted in the air. Lucas' words weren't a denial of fear, they were an affirmation that there were moments when the heart must lead, when instinct must take precedence over all other considerations. The letter from Pope Francis, the unspoken lesson of compassion, had not been just a private message to Bowman. It had become a truth, a guiding principle that now lived within him, one that defined his actions. "I wasn't scared," Lucas repeated softly, as if the words themselves were a reminder of something sacred. Sometimes, the hardest thing to do is the right thing, and the right thing is not always the easiest. The boy, though young, seemed to understand. With a small nod, he turned back to his group, leaving Bowman standing in the courtyard, his eyes following the child as he rejoined his classmates. The simple exchange, brief as it was, had carried more weight than any public gesture. It was a reminder of the power of small acts, of the ripple effect that one man's choice could have on the world. As the boy disappeared into the crowd, Lucas Bowman turned and walked away, his figure slowly fading into the shadows of the Vatican. The once glorious ceremonial icon, the symbol of the Swiss Guards' unwavering discipline, was no longer the face of rigid obedience. In the quiet of the apostolic archives, Bowman had become something else entirely, no longer bound by the spotlight, no longer the subject of public admiration. He had become a living embodiment of the Church's hidden strength, an example of love over ritual, compassion over obedience. His strength no longer lay in the uniform he wore or the ceremony he performed, but in the quiet conviction that sometimes, the truest form of service is not to stand still, but to move with love, with compassion, and with a deep understanding of what it means to serve others. In the shadows of the Vatican, Lucas Bowman had found peace. His heart, once bound by the chains of duty, had now become free to serve in the deepest, most profound way possible, not through rigid adherence to tradition, but through the living example of a heart that knew when to stand still and when to move. And in that quiet act of love, he had found a strength that would endure far beyond the ceremonial duties he had once fulfilled. A strength that could not be seen, but could always be felt. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit like and share it. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring videos. Thanks again and see you in the next one.